Hi folks, welcome to this second video dealing with activating and maintaining an effective compensation system. In the first video, we reviewed two of the four key issues in preparing for compensation system implementation. We talked about the importance of preparing the compensation budget and about compensation administration. In this video, we'll talk about the last two key issues, the first of which deals with planning for information technology. Now, we've listed several things here that we have to bear in mind if we want to make sure that we've got an information technology infrastructure in place for helping us administer the compensation system. So the first thing we talk about here is job documentation and evaluation. Don't forget, we had job descriptions, job evaluation information relating to not just our compensable factors, but any of the job evaluation points that each job scored. We want to make sure that we keep those things along with the manuals online somewhere so that they can be easily accessed not just by other people, but in the event that we need to change or update them. We also want to make sure that we have access to labor market data so that we can perform analysis. So we need to make sure that the system is built so that we can capture that kind of data because we will want to do some analysis at a later point in time. Having competitive information, not just on what we paid, but also why we paid it and what we took into consideration from the labor market, whether it's competitor information we had, it's related to geographical information, because there's some job groups that, say they're administrative assistants. You might be able to find them within your own geographic location, and you don't need to look at competitor information, but the idea is, where are we getting this market data from in order to determine, along with our job evaluation systems, how we're going to pay individuals. That all has to be kept. The third thing we need to bear in mind is the fact that there may be information that we need to communicate, not just to our own employees and managers, but also to outside providers in the event that we decide to outsource at a later date. So, for example, we might wish to communicate employee performance and relate it to pay. So, for example, if you have salespeople who are eligible for bonuses or people eligible for profit sharing, we want to make sure that we're justifying to them what we're paying them based on the data, and that data has to be kept in some kind of an information system. So we keep it so that we can analyze it, justify our compensation decisions, and as required, communicate that to our employees. We need to also make sure that the information that we collect, is kept, such as pay data, any pay history, any performance versus pay. So how did you perform and how did we pay you? There needs to be some kind of historical record kept. We also need to make sure that we keep pay and remittance calculation information. This is information that's related to payroll. Remittances to benefit providers, Canada Revenue Agency, those types of organizations. We also need to make sure that our information technology system keeps a wide variety of records available to HR people. So, for example, HR might not need to know all the details of the payroll calculation, but they may need to keep information that might be related to training. And sometimes when people get extra training and they can perform extra skills, if they're on a pay for knowledge or a pay for skills system, we need to make sure that there's a track of any training they've kept, how they've demonstrated that training to make sure that increases are processed. So there's certain record keeping that we might do through a human resources information system, which could be a subset of this larger IT system. So we need to make sure we have all that record keeping for the HR staff available. We also need to look at compensation planning and research. So what kind of information do we want to keep in addition to the information that we've stated above? We said earlier that computers can be used to help us prepare compensation budgets. They can also be used to help us make projections of future compensation costs under different assumptions. They can be used to analyze the current pay structures, to help us plan and to do research in the future. And they can also be used to help us distribute merit pay among departments. They can also be used, IT systems can also be used to help us in the planning of compensation and the research by helping us to analyze labor productivity, by helping us to analyze absenteeism and turnover rates. And they can also be helpful for helping us to conduct online surveys of employee attitudes toward the current compensation system, which might give us ideas on how we can improve it, whether it relates to direct or indirect pay. So having some basis upon which to capture all of this type of information over and above any of the other information we've talked about is important to help us plan and move forward with adjustments to the compensation system as we move forward. Last but certainly not least, we need to make sure that we keep our information private, and we need to make sure that we adhere to all the protocols to make sure that it can't be hacked into and employee information stolen or repurposed to those who are ineligible to access it. So while online computer systems can dramatically reduce the amount of paperwork that we have in administration, employers also have to protect employee rights in the process. And those rights are the right to privacy. Privacy concerns and legal restrictions on the use of electronic documents, including electronic signatures, have limited the employer's ability to introduce some electronic alternatives for payroll purposes. But in any case, any of that legislation is always subject to change. We do have a Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, known as PIPEDA, that prohibits the release of personal health information as well. So in other words, if you are a healthcare provider like Sun Life or Manulife, you have to make sure that employee health records and claims that employees have made are not made available to the employer, because that could be a source under which an employer might discriminate. So again, you need to make sure, even if you're a service provider, that you've adhered to all of the privacy and legislation that exists, and you don't make available the information outside of your own domain, outside of your own system to employers. Now we're going to look at organizing our compensation system. Let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing, because organizing for compensation administration largely involves who will do what, and not all companies decide that they want to do all the functions in-house. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages to outsourcing any areas of compensation. Some of the advantages that we know of are basically cost. Outside service providers do provide economies of scale in that they're running payrolls and they're managing healthcare benefits for so many other companies. So for your company to be added on might not be as big a deal for them as for you to have to recreate that same infrastructure. The expertise is another advantage. Sometimes outside providers have better specializations. They have specialized legal and professional experts at their fingertips that help them to maintain your system in accordance with legislation that might come down, and sometimes small or medium-sized companies simply can't afford to do that. Larger-sized companies sometimes can, but smaller employers maybe not. So for them, outsourcing might be a route to go. But just as we say there are advantages, don't forget, disadvantages also loom. An employer may lose touch with any of the emerging issues and problems, and even lose the capacity to understand their benefit system. So in other words, if you're going to leave so much in the hands or in the control of an outside service provider, you have to make sure that you as the corporation don't lose track of what's going on, because you ultimately have to communicate the system to your employees, the compensation system, so that they know how they're being paid and how they're being assessed. Sometimes, if you rely too heavily on advice from service providers, they may not understand your organizational context, especially if you're making changes to your managerial strategy. Now, this might not be as big an issue if you have a classical managerial strategy, because you probably don't have a very robust or constant need to change your compensation system. But say you were trying to move to a more human relations, or even beyond that to a high involvement strategy. You you may find that your compensation system may need to be a little more elaborate. So you need to make sure that you can't rely just on the advice of outside service providers. You need to make sure that you're taking a little bit of control into how that system is going to be changed or needs to be changed in order to communicate what you want to the outside providers. And sometimes there's some stuff that gets lost in translation. Now, I'm not sure how much of the slide you can actually see, but we also have to make sure that we understand the impact it's going to have on employee morale, especially if it's necessary to lay off employees. So usually with outsourcing of whether it's payroll systems or compensation administration systems, if we had any employees in our organization handling those functions, we usually find that we may not have the same level of need for them. So it's important for an employer to plan for how they might use that skilled labor that they have, if there's other areas they can use them in, and if not, they terminate them and make sure that they have control of what the cost of severance and any termination counseling that they might need to consider. So of course, that's an added cost when you need to terminate people. So that could lead to a disadvantage, and not only for the employees who are being terminated, but also for the employees who remain, because they see the results that technology can have. So it's up to the employer to allay some of those fears and trepidations that staff might have when they start to see some of our people who are administering compensation and payroll being displaced. The other thing we need to think about when we're organizing for compensation administration is we need to consider some things before we even think about outsourcing. How big is your company? That makes a difference. Why? Because sometimes larger companies have a more elaborate compensation system and they like to do things in-house just so they can maintain better control. Sometimes if you're a public sector company and you have multiple unions, this might be important because you're administering salary increases and benefits under multiple different collective labor agreements. This is found in some healthcare institutions and other institutions out there, so you need to be careful. You may also need to look at the internal capabilities of companies. So again, if your company is a smaller company, but you are a high involvement organization, you have a lot to consider. You may not be able to afford to hire staff to manage all that for you. So it might be that you decide to outsource it. It might be that you decide you want to keep it in-house because it's high involvement. So you need to decide how you want to manage that. You also have to look at the complexity and the dynamism of the compensation system. So how frequently do you think it's subject to change? If you're in an environment where you are administering multiple collective labor agreements and your agreements are a shorter term, you might decide you want to manage more of that in-house. But that again is your call. And some companies also want to look at the strategic importance of compensation and the role that might play in swaying their decision to outsource or not. So where compensation systems are of key strategic importance, companies may choose not to outsource because they want to reduce leakage of any of that key information. So again, you have to decide whether or not outsourcing might be right for you. And again, that's your choice. So at this point, we're going to stop our video, and then in our next segment, we will discuss developing an implementation plan.